A bell rang in the dead of night from a tower sealed shut for over a decade, and when they opened it, they didn't find rust or pigeons. They found bones, and the widow of the town's most beloved priest was the only one who knew why. But what she uncovered didn't just shake a church, it burned it to the ground. Watch the full story to learn how silence killed, and how a daughter made the dead speak again. He screamed and dropped the lantern when the bell rang. The sharp metallic cry shattered the silence like glass across midnight. The man stumbled backward in terror as the sound echoed down the French Quarter. A light mist coated the pavement, the kind only New Orleans seems to conjure when secrets need a place to settle. He was just a groundskeeper, a drunk, maybe with trembling hands and a cigarette dangling off his lower lip. But what he found at the foot of Trinity Church would haunt a city. I had not been home in over 10 years. The last time I stood before Trinity Church was the day we buried my father, the beloved Reverend Thomas Sullivan. I was 24, just out of law school, and still believed in systems that worked, in churches that saved, and in families that forgave. But I left that day with my mother clinging to my arm and her mind slipping into something distant, hollow and unreachable. She was the widow of a saint, and the town treated her like a ghost. My name is Claire Marie Sullivan, and I am a defense attorney in Chicago. I do not believe in hauntings or divine punishments. I believe in evidence, in truth, and in fighting battles inside courtrooms, not church towers. So when I received the call that my mother Eleanor had died quietly in her sleep, I did not cry. I booked a flight and packed black clothes. I thought it would be a quiet funeral for a forgotten woman. Instead, I arrived to a crime scene. The bell at Trinity Church had not rung since the fire, that fire 10 years ago that claimed my father and gutted the east wing, leaving the tower charred and abandoned. It was welded shut. Or so we thought, but somehow last night it rang, just once. And in the morning they found bones, human bones, curled beneath the rotted staircase and stuffed into an old baptismal box. No one wanted to say it out loud, but I could feel it rising in their throats. The widow Eleanor Sullivan must have known. The local paper printed a picture of the box half open with a pale fingerbone reaching out like a final plea. The caption was simple and cruel. Widow found dead. Church holds a secret. My flight touched down just as the headlines screamed. Across social media, news vans circled the church like vultures over holy ruins. I stepped out into the thick Louisiana air and tasted judgment on my tongue. I remember standing outside the church gates in my black suit, staring at the police tape that flapped like torn scripture. Reverend Mark Geller stood beside the news anchor, waving his hands as if blessing the scandal. I knew him. He had taken over after my father. The diocese called him a progressive reformer, but locals whispered other things. Things about his temper, his obsession with appearances, and how my mother once tried to file a complaint and found her letters returned, unopened. Detective Juan Harris was the one who met me at the edge of the church courtyard. He was tall, his skin a deep brown, and his voice low like someone who had heard too many lies and remembered each one. "Ma'am," he said, "the remains are human, and they're old. We think over 20 years, possibly more. But what's troubling is that they were buried here, in a space nobody was supposed to access." I asked if he suspected foul play. He just looked at me for a long beat, and then replied softly, "Ma'am, we don't think your mother put those bones there, but she might have known they were, and if she did, she carried that secret a long time." My mother's body was already at the funeral home by then, dressed in the blue dress she wore to my law school graduation. They said she died in peace, but when I looked at her hands I saw the story. They tried to hide. Her fingers were calloused, like she had been gripping something with all her might. A truth, maybe a memory, a regret. The old neighbors barely made eye contact at the memorial. Some offered murmurs of sympathy, others turned away. I saw Mrs. Delacroix, the one who used to bring us gumbo every Sunday, glance toward me, then toward the church and whisper to her, "Husband." That woman was not crazy, she was scared. My mother's house was a time capsule. The curtains unchanged, the crucifix still hanging above the fireplace, and my father's study door still locked. I walked room by room through silence, thick as confession, until I reached the attic, and there, in a rusted tin box, were letters, dozens of them addressed to the New Orleans diocese, to the archbishop, to local journalists. All returned unopened, marked "Return to sender." She had tried to tell someone my mother had written of screams in the night, the sound of the bell tolling at odd hours, the shadow of a man entering the tower when no one else was around, and always her final line was the same: "Please listen, before someone else dies." That night I sat alone in her kitchen drinking sweet tea that tasted like childhood and ashes. The city buzzed with heat and the smell of magnolias and mildew. I stared at those letters, and for the first time in years I did not see my mother as a fading widow, but as a warrior, a silent one, a trapped one. I knew what came next. I would stay. I would find out what lay beneath that tower and what my father had hidden before he died. Because something was wrong in Trinity Church. Something that rang once in the night to wake the dead and call the living back to reckon. And I, Claire Marie Sullivan, was not afraid of ghosts. I was afraid of silence and the lies it fed. When I was young, I used to sit on the front pew of Trinity Church, legs dangling, not quite touching the floor, while my father spoke from the pulpit with a voice that could quiet storms. People adored him. Reverend Thomas Sullivan was the kind of man who made God sound like home, but even then I sensed the weight behind my mother's eyes as she watched him, that quiet ache, the way her fingers twisted the place edge of her hymn book, the way she smiled at everyone but never at herself. After the fire that took his life, they told us it was faulty wiring, that he had gone back into the church to save an altar boy who had wandered off, that he was a hero, but there was no altar boy. No one missing, no witnesses, just a tower, consumed in flames, and my mother's scream echoing into the dawn. They found him at the base of the stairs, neck, broken lungs, blackened from smoke, his Bible clutched in one hand, burnt to the leather. They called it tragedy. I called it unfinished. Now, standing in front of Detective Juan Harris, I felt that ache again, only sharper, the colder. I had returned for a funeral, and now I was being drawn into an investigation that smelled of rot and sanctimony. Harris was calm, almost too calm, as he flipped through his notebook. His badge glinted under the southern sun. "Miss Sullivan, your mother Eleanor, was mentioned in parish records as having requested access to the bell tower 3 times over the past decade." He looked up carefully. "We have no record of her being granted that access, but someone let her in at least once." I crossed my arms. She was never allowed to speak at any of the council meetings. She wrote letters, they were ignored. She tried to report something and they called her unstable. Unstable, Harris echoed. That's a word folks like to use when a woman refuses to stay quiet. That day, I walked the path my mother had walked alone for years, past neighbors who refused to meet my gaze, past the church that buried its secrets under stained glass and incense. I walked back into her house, a woman's house, a widow's house, a place of whispers and silence, and found the envelope on the kitchen table, still sealed, addressed to me in her careful, tight handwriting. Claire read this if I ever failed to come back from the church. I opened it, hands trembling, and there it was, the truth unraveling in ink. She had discovered something in the bell tower, not long after my father's death. She had seen him go up there days before the fire, carrying a large box wrapped in cloth. She had waited hours for him to come down, but he never did that night. The fire started the following evening. She suspected he was hiding something, that it involved more than church finances or relics. She wrote that she believed he had discovered a crime from years earlier, and that in trying to bury it, he had become part of it. I sat in that kitchen with the letter, pressed to my chest, breathing memories and dust. My father, the hero, my mother, the madwoman, and me, the girl who ran from it all thinking the past would stay buried. The next morning, I met with Reverend Mark Geller in his office at Trinity. He was everything. My father was not charismatic, polished, ambitious. His handshake was firm, his smile professional but cold. He offered condolences and tea. I declined. Both. Reverend Geller. My mother tried to reach out to the church multiple times. Her letters were never answered. Do you know why? He sighed heavily, as if the weight of her desperation inconvenienced him. Eleanor was deeply troubled after Thomas passed. We tried to be compassionate, but she was unpredictable. Sometimes she claimed to hear voices in the walls or see people in the tower, long after it was sealed. Or maybe she was telling the truth, I said quietly. He leaned forward, clasping his hands. Claire, with all due respect, this church has served this community for over a century. We cannot entertain every accusation, especially when it comes from someone grieving and alone. I left without another word. I didn't need his blessing. I needed answers. Later that evening, I visited the library searching archives, newspapers, anything that might explain why bones were found in that tower. I came across a brief mention in a local column from 1982, a missing child, Rodney Banks, age 9, last seen near the Trinity courtyard after Sunday school. Police believed he had run away. Case unsolved. My blood ran cold. I brought this to Detective Harris, who scanned the article, then looked up sharply. "You think this is him?" I nodded. "I think my mother did too." The next day I returned to Trinity not to pray but to search. I wandered the outer gardens until I found her spot, a wooden bench tucked between two magnolia trees. She used to sit there every evening after sunset, staring at the tower like it. Owed her something like it. Held the last words she never got to say to my father. I noticed something under the bench. A rusted key taped beneath the seat. It was small brass and labeled simply North Tower. My hands shook as I held it, and I realized that even in her silence, even as they called her mad, my mother had been leaving me a trail. Back at her house, I opened a shoebox from her closet. It was filled with newspaper clippings, photographs of children smiling in Sunday school robes, and one grainy image of a boy standing outside the tower, a ribbon pinned to his chest. Rodney Banks written in shaky pen across the bottom. I knew then that my mother had never been unstable. She had been grieving and ignored. She had been trying to uncover something terrible, and had done it alone for years. That night I stood in front of the North Tower, key in hand, my heart thudding like it was trying to escape my chest. The tower was still sealed, but the lock looked recently changed. Newer than the rest of the building. I slid the key in and turned. The door opened, with a groan older than time, and the darkness inside did not welcome me. It warned me, but I stepped inside anyway, because I was not my mother, and I would not die with the truth still trapped behind stone walls and stained glass. The air inside the tower was colder than outside, colder than it had any right to be in a Louisiana summer. It wrapped around my arms like a warning, like the whispers of every prayer spoken inside these walls but never heard the staircase. Wound upward in a dizzying spiral. Its wood rotted in patches and dust, thick enough to coat my shoes with every step I climbed. With the brass key clenched in my fist, and my mother's letter folded in my coat pocket, as if she were climbing with me. Each creak of the wood beneath my feet felt like a confession, a reluctant surrender from a structure that had hidden too much for too long. At the top I found a narrow landing and a door barely hanging on its hinges. The padlock had been broken recently. Its metal bent with force, not age. Someone had been here before. Someone who did not want it to stay locked anymore. I pushed the door open and there it was. The bell tarnished by time, but still massive, suspended in the center of the chamber above the wooden platform that overlooked the city. And beside it, not far from where the workers found the bones, was a small opening in the floor covered by a plank now cracked down the center. I crouched low and peered into the darkness beneath. It was not deep, barely large enough to fit a person curled in fetal position. The wood smelled of mildew and something older. Older than rot. Older than death. I lit the flashlight on my phone and aimed it into the hole. Bones, not just one set, but 2 ribs, hips, what looked like the edge of a child's skull tucked behind an old candle holder. I fell back, breath gone from my lungs. This was not just one tragedy. This was a tomb. I called Detective Harris. His voice was calm, but I could hear him moving quickly. "We'll be there in 10 minutes, he said. "Keep the door locked and don't touch anything." But as I stood to leave, I heard it, a whisper low, and almost like wind, but with shape, with meaning. It said her name, my mother's name. I ran down the stairs 2 steps at a time, breath-ragged knees trembling by the time I reached the courtyard. Harris and his team arrived just as I reached the gate. They didn't ask questions. They followed me up and cordoned off the area, as the forensic team pulled the remains out piece by piece. Harris turned to me and said softly, "We need to talk about your father." Back at the station, he laid out a file, aged and yellowing. Across the top it read Rodney Banks, missing person, case opened 1982. Inside were photographs, a school ID, report cards, even a police sketch of what he might look like. at age 30. If he had survived, that sketch looked nothing like the bones in that bell tower. Claire Harris said slowly, "What I'm about to tell you never made it into any official file. Your father was questioned once, not formally, just as a respected community leader. Rodney's parents said he had last been seen helping move supplies into the church storage. Your dad said he never saw him, but there was one thing that never sat right." He pulled out a slip of paper, a witness statement unsigned. A neighbor reported seeing a man in robes carrying a boy toward the bell tower. The boy looked limp, like he was asleep or worse. They didn't think much of it then, because who would? Suspect a priest. I swallowed hard. The image of my father in his white robes stained with smoke from the fire he died in flickered in my mind. Could he really have? Harris watched my face. "You don't have to answer now, but I think your mum found this before she died. Maybe even years ago, and I think she knew more than anyone gave her credit for." Back at my mother's house, I searched through her old journals, pages filled with her tight cursive looping with grief and anger and determination. One entry from 3 years ago read, "I saw Mark near the tower again. He thinks I don't notice, but I know he's afraid. Afraid I'll find the rest." I think Thomas only knew half the truth. That night I returned to Trinity and knocked on the door of the old parish hall where Mrs. Marlene lived, the last choir director before the fire. Her apartment was small and smelled of lavender and dust, but her eyes were sharp despite her 80 years. She opened the door and said, "I've been waiting for you, child." She led me to the kitchen and poured 2 cups of tea without asking. She didn't say anything for a long time, just watched me over the rim of her cup. Then she spoke. "Your mother was not crazy, Claire. She was brave, and she loved you enough to protect you from all of this until you were ready to face it. She came to me years ago, showed me pictures, letters, even that child's ID. She said she had found him, or what was left of him. But no one would listen." "Did she ever tell you who put him there?" I asked. She shook her head slowly. "Only that your father knew. He found the boy's body one night after choir practice. Eleanor thought he had gone to the police, but he didn't. Instead, the next day he sealed the tower, claimed it was unsafe. Then, a week later, the fire." My voice barely rose above a whisper. "And Reverend Geller," Mrs. Marlene's face tightened. "He arrived after the fire, but he knew something. I saw him once in the tower, long after it was sealed, carrying a box out wrapped in cloth just like your father did before him. That night I could not sleep. I sat by the window watching the church steeple cast a shadow across the moonlit street. My mother had not just stumbled upon a crime. She had carried it alone for years. She had pieced together the past brick by brick, letter by letter, while the world dismissed her as broken. But she had left me the key, literally and figuratively, and now it was mine to turn. I was not the daughter of madness. I was the daughter of a woman who had looked at the darkness and refused to look away. And for the first time in my life, I did not run. I stayed and stared back. I had never heard my mother raise her voice, not even when my father disappeared into late-night meetings or when the neighbors whispered behind their hands. She endured things with a grace I mistook for surrender, but now I knew it was resistance, a quiet defiance held beneath her breath and between the lines of every letter she ever wrote. They called her delusional, but she was documenting a war inside Trinity Church that no one else dared to name. Detective Harris called the next morning to confirm the forensic report. 2 skeletons had been recovered from beneath the bell tower. One belonged to Rodney Banks, identified through dental fragments matched to school records. The other was an adult female aged approximately 35, with no immediate identifiers. The cause of death in both cases was blunt force trauma to the skull, but the dates were nearly 15 years apart. The boy died in 1982. The woman, sometime around 1997. I asked who she might have been. Harris shook his head and said, "We don't know yet, but someone didn't want her found, and someone had access to that tower after your father died." I walked home under a sky as grey as lead. The streets of the French Quarter buzzed with the usual sounds of music and footsteps and laughter. But they all felt distant, like I was watching life through a stained glass window my mother had lived in this town, carrying the weight of these secrets. And now I had picked them up like a cursed heirloom. I opened her closet that afternoon for the first time since the funeral. Her scent still lingered, faintly lavender, soap and parchment, and something older like cedar. I found a box beneath the coats lined with letters, newspaper clippings, and one photograph that made me sit on the floor and gasp. It showed a young woman in a choir robe standing beside my father, both smiling, but her eyes were wary, cautious. At the back was a note written in my mother's hand. Her name was Lillian. She came to Trinity in '95, left in '97. No one ever spoke of her again. I showed the photo to Mrs. Marlene, who covered her mouth the moment she saw it. She whispered Lillian Cooper. She was our soprano voice, sweet as honey. Thomas adored her, everyone knew it. But she disappeared one night, just vanished, Reverend. Geller told everyone. She moved out of state, but I never believed it. Now I had names, faces, timelines, a picture with too many shadows and not enough answers. I took it all to Harris, who sat silently for several minutes before saying, "If this is true, someone used that church like a hunting ground. Someone buried their sins in holy places and wrapped them in silence." The next evening I attended a town hall at Trinity. Reverend Geller stood at the podium addressing the press and parishioners with practiced sincerity. He said the church was cooperating fully with authorities, and that this tragedy, while heartbreaking, would not shake their faith. But as he spoke, I noticed his hands tremble slightly and his eyes dart toward the back of the room where I stood. When the questions began, I raised my hand. My voice was steady, but it rang through the sanctuary like thunder. "Reverend Geller, did you know Lillian Cooper?" He froze. The room stilled. He forced a smile. "She was part of our choir some years ago. A lovely young woman, I believe she moved to Georgia." I stepped forward, holding up the photograph. She never arrived in Georgia. Her family never heard from her again. Her last known location was this church, and now we have bones in the bell tower, Reverend. What should we believe? The congregation began murmuring. Reverend Geller's face paled. Security moved toward me, but Harris appeared at my side like a shadow and held up his badge. "Let her speak," he said. "She has the right." So I did. I told them about the letters my mother wrote, about the boy who vanished, and the woman who disappeared, about the silence that wrapped around this place like ivy, choking truth from the walls. I read excerpts from my mother's journal, her pleas for someone to listen. The room was quiet when I finished, but not silent. The silence had broken. People looked at me, then at each other, and something shifted. The weight of doubt fell from their shoulders, replaced by something sharper and clearer: anger. Outside, reporters swarmed me, lights flashing, microphones pressing against my face. I said only one thing: my mother was not mad, she was brave, and now we will finish what she started. Back home, I lit every lamp in the house, unable to bear the shadows. I reread my mother's last letter over and over again. In the margin of one page, I saw something I had missed before: a smudge of ink that looked like it had been wet with tears. And beneath it, barely legible, one last line. The tower was not the only place they used. Look beneath the choir floor. I went back to Trinity just before dawn. Harris met me there, his jaw clenched as he held a crowbar. The choir hall was empty, the pews cold, the organ still dusty from disuse. Together we pried up the corner tiles, and beneath them a trapdoor, covered in mold and nailed shut, with old rusted iron. It took us nearly an hour to open it, but when we did, a smell of earth and rot and something older than secrets rushed up to meet us. Inside we found boxes, old hymnals, blood-stained cloth, and another body half buried in the dirt, a gold cross, still clutched in her hand. Harris stared down into the darkness and whispered, "They used this place like a tomb, and no one saw, no one asked, no one believed." I stared down too and whispered back, "Someone did. My mother did." And now I would not stop until the church rang with her voice, louder than any sermon ever spoken, louder than the bell that started it all, because silence had kept this place holy for too long. Now it was time for truth to make it sacred again. The morning after we uncovered the third body, I stood on the steps of Trinity Church, with my mother's journal clutched tightly in my hands. The sunrise cast long shadows across the courtyard, and the bell tower loomed like a relic of guilt. Frozen in time, I hadn't slept. My thoughts were stitched together with grief, rage, and a kind of clarity I had never known before. For every secret my mother had buried, she had also left a trail, not just for me, but for anyone willing to look. I was no longer just the daughter of a dead priest and a silenced widow. I was the voice neither of them had been allowed to raise. Detective Harris met me on the front pew of the sanctuary where the light from the stained glass windows spilled onto the floor like spilled wine. He held a manila folder and a face full of questions. We ran prints on the latest remains. He said quietly, "The body under the choir floor. It's Lillian Cooper." I nodded. I had already known, but hearing it aloud was like pulling stitches from a wound too early and watching it bleed again. Her family had filed a missing persons report in 1997, but no follow-up was ever made. Not by the police, not by the church, not by anyone. Harris leaned back, sighed, and looked up at the wooden cross hanging above the altar. "Something's wrong with how deep this goes, Claire. Your father knew something. He may have tried to stop it, or maybe he didn't. But either way, your mother carried this alone for far too long. I looked up at the cross too, but I didn't see salvation there. I saw burden. I saw silence lacquered in gold and nailed to a wall where it could not speak." That afternoon I went back to my parents' house and opened the last drawer in my father's old study, the one I had always been afraid to touch. The drawer was stuck, warped with time, but eventually it gave way. Inside was a cassette tape, labeled simply, "Choir, Practice the 12th of April." I found an old player and pressed play. The hiss of static filled the room, followed by distant, singing a choir of voices rising in harmony, and then a sudden break, a thud, a scream, and a male voice low and trembling saying, "She wasn't supposed to fight back. I didn't mean to, God. Forgive me." I dropped the player as if it burned. I called Harris, and when he arrived, we played the tape together. When it ended, he said nothing, just looked at me, and then picked up his phone. "We need a warrant," he said. "We need to go through every inch of this church." The search began that same evening. Forensics swept the sanctuary, the bell tower, the basement closets, and even the confessional booths. Dogs were brought in. They found fragments of clothing in the crawl spaces beneath the altar and in the basement. An old trunk sealed with wax containing more hymnals, of blood on the pages, a broken rosary, and what appeared to be a child's shoe. Reverend Geller arrived during the search, his face ashen and his voice loud with outrage. "You have no right to desecrate this place," he shouted. "This is a house of God." Detective Harris stepped forward, held up the tape recorder and pressed play. The voice filled the sanctuary again. "She wasn't supposed to fight back. I didn't mean to." Geller's face crumbled in on itself. He staggered back, gripping a pew as if the world had tilted beneath his feet. "Claire," he said, barely a whisper, "you don't understand. This place, it eats people." "No," I replied. "It hides them." That night, the town council held an emergency meeting. The church board was present. Parishioners packed the room. Local reporters lined the walls. I stood at the front holding my mother's letters, the photo of Lillian, the forensic reports, the tape. I read my mother's words aloud to a room full of people who had once called her mad. They listened in silence. Some cried, others looked away. Reverend Geller sat in the corner staring down at his hands as if the blood had only just appeared there. I finished with the last line from her final journal entry. "If I must be called mad for speaking, then I choose madness over silence, because silence is what keeps the dead from resting." The vote was unanimous. Reverend Geller was removed from his post. The church was to be closed pending a full investigation, and memorial plaques were approved for the victims, Rodney Banks, Lillian Cooper, and the third woman still unidentified. Outside the church that night, a small crowd gathered with candles. Someone began singing an old hymn, not out of worship, but out of mourning. And as the voices joined, the bell at Trinity tolled again, not by the hand of clergy or choir, but by the workers dismantling the tower for evidence. And in that sound I heard my mother. I stood beneath that crumbling symbol of faith with Harris beside me and the town around me, and I realized this wasn't just justice. It was resurrection, not of saints but of truth, not of doctrine but of dignity. My mother had tried to speak, and now the whole world was listening. And I would keep speaking until the last grave had a name, until the last lie to add a witness, until Trinity Church became known not for what it preached, but for what it finally confessed. The following morning I sat alone in my childhood kitchen staring at the same tile countertop where my mother once folded my school lunches, humming softly to herself. The air felt thicker now, as if the house held its breath with me. Replayed the tape again, listening to that familiar but distant male voice, break with fear and guilt. She wasn't supposed to fight back. I didn't mean to, God forgive me. I had grown up believing my father was a man of unwavering moral strength, a pillar in this community, who died a martyr in fire and faith. But now I questioned everything, including my own memory. Detective Harris stopped by just after noon with a folder in hand and a silence in his eyes that told me I was not going to like what came next. He sat across from me and laid down a weathered church ledger. Its pages were yellowed ink, faded, but in the margins of one page, someone had scribbled initials TC and LC beside a date, April 12, 1997, the same date as the tape. "That's the night Lillian Cooper disappeared," Harris said quietly. "This ledger shows she was scheduled for private confession with Reverend Thomas Sullivan, your father, Claire." I leaned back. The chair creaked beneath me. The world did not spin or fall. It simply stilled like a held breath, waiting for the next sound to determine its shape. "Are you saying my father killed her?" I asked. "I'm saying he might have known who did, and he covered it up," Harris replied. "We found ashes in the old incinerator behind the rectory. Ashes that matched hymnal paper, bone fragments and cloth. The incinerator hadn't been used in years, but one of our analysts said it had last been lit sometime around April 1997. I could hardly breathe. My father had been a man of sermons, of midnight prayers of forgiveness and light. But what if he had found Lillian dying, or already gone, and instead of alerting the authorities he had chosen to bury her to protect someone or something? The church, maybe his name, maybe even me. In my mother's journals, I found a page folded 3 times and tucked deep into the back. It wasn't like the other entries. This one was written in ink that bled slightly, as if her hand had trembled while writing. "Thomas came home with blood on his collar. He said it was wine from the altar. But I saw his eyes. They were not filled with God. They were filled with shame. I didn't confront him then. I was afraid not of him, but of what he would tell me. And when the fire came a week later, I did not grieve. I watched the flames and whispered to them, 'Please, let this be the last secret.'" I closed the book slowly. My father's silence had allowed more than one secret to take root. My mother's silence had tried to protect me from that garden of decay. And now all that remained was me and the truth they left behind. That evening, I walked into the now empty sanctuary of Trinity Church. The lights had been cut for investigation, and only faint sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows. I stood at the pulpit, the very place my father once preached, to crowds who saw holiness in his every word. I remembered one sermon in particular, the one he gave after Rodney Banks went missing. He spoke of loss of the devil's work in stealing innocence, and how we must not let grief become vengeance. And I remember how tightly my mother gripped my hand during that service, her knuckles white, her eyes never once leaving his face. He knew then. I whispered to the silence. I turned to leave when I heard footsteps behind me. Reverend Mark Geller stood near the confessional booth, his expression hollow. He looked older than before, or perhaps I was just seeing him clearly now. "You've torn down everything, Claire," he said quietly. "This church, this town, this legacy." "No," I replied. "I've exposed it." He stepped forward. "The things your father did, they were for the greater good. He protected this church, its reputation, the community. We all make sacrifices. Lillian wasn't a sacrifice. She was a person," I snapped. "So was Rodney. So was the woman in the tower. And my mother. She carried the weight of all of you, pretending to be holy, while you let children vanish and women die." Geller's face twisted. Something dark flickered in his eyes. She wasn't supposed to go digging if Eleanor had just stayed quiet like the rest of us. "You threatened her, didn't you?" I asked, my voice low but sharp. "You made her believe that silence was the only way to protect me." He didn't answer, but his eyes said everything I needed to know. Detective Harris entered just then, his voice firm. "Reverend Geller, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice and failure to report a crime." His handcuffs clicked like punctuation in a sentence, too long suppressed. Geller didn't struggle. He lowered his head and whispered more to himself than to us. "Thomas tried to save her. You know he tried." Later, Harris and I sat on the church steps, watching as the last of the parishioners trickled away. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the courtyard. "Your mother could have exposed this years ago," Harris said. "She had enough. She just didn't want to hurt you." "I know," I replied softly. "She made a choice. She chose to live with the truth so I could grow up with a lie. He nodded. And now you're making a different choice. I looked at the church one last time. It would never be a sanctuary again. Not for me, not for the town. It would be a place of reckoning, a place where voices once silenced had begun to rise. I brushed off my coat and said, "Then let's make sure it echoes, because if my father's legacy was silence, and my mother's was endurance, then mine would be justice, and I would speak until no one could pretend not to hear." By the end of that week, the headlines stretched across every local paper and spilled into national news feeds. Priest's daughter exposes, decades of cover, up at historic church, and widow's secret journal, unravels, Trinity murders, the bell, tower that once crowned the skyline of New Orleans with solemn grace, now stood wrapped in yellow crime. Scene tape, a monument not to faith but to secrets I watched from my mother's porch as parishioners passed by, their faces etched with disbelief, as though the stained glass they had prayed beneath for years had suddenly shattered and the fortuned sunlight revealed too much. Reverend Mark Geller was arraigned in court on charges of obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy to conceal multiple deaths. The courtroom was packed the air, heavy with grief and rage, as Geller stood before the judge, not in his robes, but in an orange jumpsuit. Hands cuffed, his once proud posture broken. The judge denied bail, citing risk of further tampering with evidence and possible flight. Geller didn't look at anyone, not even the priest who came to offer him prayer. But it was not over. The community demanded more than an arrest. They wanted truth full and unfiltered. They wanted to know who else had known, who else had looked away, and how such horror had been allowed to grow beneath crosses and candles. Detective Harris and I returned to the diocesan archives with a warrant in hand and a determination sharpened by grief. The basement of the diocese building was filled with dust and ledgers, handwritten baptism records, marriage logs, donation sheets, and disciplinary files. Many had never been digitized or even opened since the 80s. In one of them we found a letter dated May 4, 1982, signed by a Monsignor Leonard Voss, then the bishop's assistant. It warned of an incident involving a young boy named Rodney Banks and urged that the church investigate Reverend Thomas Sullivan's Sunday school methods quietly to preserve public trust. The letter was marked confidential and bore a red stamp, denied inquiry, closed. I stared at the ink until my vision blurred. They had known, and they had chosen silence. We brought the evidence to the current diocese leadership, Bishop Ronald Pierce, a man who had only recently taken his seat. He was known for progressive reform and transparency. He read the letter slowly, then looked up with horror in his eyes. "I was told this file never existed," he said quietly. "I will make a public statement immediately." And he did. The next day, standing at the foot of the church steps, Bishop Pierce addressed, the city cameras flashing microphones pressing against his robes. He named the victims. He condemned the decades of silence. He disbanded the entire church board and vowed full cooperation with state and federal investigations. It was the first time Trinity Church had heard truth spoken into its walls without a trace of fear. But the town was still restless. There was one man left, whom everyone still remembered with reverence, my father. I did not ask for a press conference. I did not seek attention. But the media found me standing by the cemetery gate after placing lilies on my mother's grave. "Miss Sullivan," one reporter called, "Did your father kill Lillian Cooper? Did he kill Rodney Banks?" I turned and met their gaze. "My father was complicit," I said softly. "He may not have struck the final blow, but he helped bury the bodies, and that makes him part of their deaths. He failed to protect them, and he failed to protect the woman who loved him." The silence that followed was unlike any I had felt before. It wasn't hostile or mocking. It was grieving, honest, raw. Mrs. Marlene reached out to me later that day. She invited me to her home again, where the walls were lined with hymn books and fading photos of choirs long disbanded. She handed me an envelope worn at the edges. It was from my mother, dated just 6 months before her death. "Claire, if you are reading this, then you have gone where I could not go. You have seen what I could not stop. I tried so many times, but I always feared the cost for you, for the name we shared, for the community I had once believed in. But I know, now that truth is never a curse. It is a cleansing fire. Let it burn until no lie can hide behind stained glass. I love you always, Mom. I held the letter to my chest and let myself cry. Truly cry, not just for her or for the victims or even for my father, but for every silence that had cost a life and every voice that had never been heard. That night, Trinity Church was vandalized. Someone spray-painted the words, "They were here," on the front doors in bright red paint. The mayor condemned it, but I understood it. It was grief, shouting in color what had been whispered for too long. At the town's request, a memorial service was held, not inside the church but outside on the lawn, where the community could gather without walls, without hierarchy. I was asked to speak not as a lawyer or a daughter, but as someone who had listened. I stood before them and said, "My mother was not crazy, she was courageous. She tried to speak, but no one would listen. Now we must all listen, not just to her voice, but to those who were taken and those who remain afraid. Speak louder than the bells that failed them." When I finished, the crowd stood in silence. Then applause began, gentle, then rising, and soon they were on their feet, not clapping for me, but for the dead who had finally been seen. The next day, the diocese announced that Trinity Church would be closed permanently. The building would be converted into a community justice center and counseling space for survivors of abuse. The bell would be melted down its bronze cast into plaques, bearing the names of the victims found and those still unknown. Geller was moved to a federal facility pending trial. More clergy came forward quietly admitting they had heard rumors over the years and never dared to dig. My father's legacy was being rewritten page by page, not to destroy him, but to ensure no other child would kneel at a confessional without safety. My mother's journals were published in part by a non-profit survivor advocacy group. The first page bore her signature and the final line in bold ink. I was never mad. I was mourning, and the town mourned with her. Finally, justice had not come easily. It had not come clean, but it had come. And in the broken echo of the fallen church, something new began to grow. Not faith in stained glass or men in robes, but in each other in truth, in the kind of love that demands nothing less than the whole story. And I knew this was only the beginning. The courtroom was packed with rows of wooden benches, filled not with parishioners, but with survivors, journalists, lawyers, and former believers whose faith had been shattered, not by atheism or rebellion, but by truth. The trial of Reverend Mark Geller was the beginning of something larger than him. It was the reckoning of an institution that had buried sins in sacraments and called it holy. I sat in the front row, flanked by Detective Juan Harris and Mrs. Marlene, with my mother's journal resting like scripture in my lap. Geller entered in cuffs, his priest collar gone, replaced by a county-issued suit wrinkled and faded. The man who had once stood atop the altar speaking of salvation now shuffled like a ghost of authority. His eyes scanned the room, and for a brief second they found mine, but there was no hate, no anger, only exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying rot too long beneath polished wood and polished words. The prosecution began with the bodies, names, not numbers: Rodney Banks, Lillian Cooper, Jane Doe. They laid out the dates, locations, forensics, the matching dental records, the fibers found in the choir floorboards, the tape from 1997, and the key found under my mother's garden bench that opened the North Tower. They displayed it all, and let silence do the rest. But the most powerful moment came when Bishop Ronald Pierce took the stand. A man of the cloth called to testify against his own. Pierce cleared his throat and looked at the judge with calm, steady eyes. "I cannot undo what those before me did." "Not do," he said. "But I can speak to what I now know, and I know that this church failed these people, failed them in silence, in cowardice, and in self-preservation. And for that I offer not defense, but apology." The gallery was silent. Even the reporters lowered their pens. Then came my turn. I had not wanted to testify. I had spoken enough in letters, in interviews, in town meetings, but this was different. This was sworn truth. I walked to the stand and placed my hand on the Bible. I had once watched my father hold as he married and buried half the town. "I swear to tell the truth," I said, my voice unwavering, "because the truth is the only thing that didn't die in that church." I told the jury about my mother, about the journals, the photo of Lillian, the returned letters, the moment I stood in the bell tower and saw bones instead of hope. I described the smell of old secrets, the sound of a confession never meant to be heard. And the way my father came home with ashes in his hair and silence in his eyes, I ended with her words. If I must be called mad for speaking, then I choose madness over silence. When I stepped down, no one clapped, no one cheered. They just watched me as if seeing my mother in me for the first time. The defense tried to paint Geller as a scapegoat, a victim of a failing system, but the jury saw what we all saw. Not innocence, but participation. Not mistake, but pattern. The verdict came 2 days later. Guilty on all counts, sentencing to be determined pending further federal investigation into church-wide misconduct. But as the judge read the decision, I felt no triumph, only release like an exhale 10 years too late. Outside the courthouse, someone had placed 3 white candles on the steps, one for each victim found inside Trinity Church. Flowers had begun to gather too, and handwritten notes addressed to Eleanor Sullivan. My mother had become a symbol, not of madness, but of memory, the kind that does not fade with time. Mrs. Marlene took my hand as we walked through the crowd. She would have been proud of you, she whispered. Not just for the justice, but for never letting her become the villain in their story. Detective Harris nodded quietly and said, "People think justice is about punishment, but sometimes it's about unburying what was hidden so others can breathe again." That night we held a vigil not in the church but on the lawn outside, where the bell had once cast its long shadow. I was asked to speak again, but this time I declined. Instead, we played a recording of my mother's voice, one I had found on an NDever old tape from a town hall meeting years ago, before they stopped letting her speak. She had said, "I believe in redemption, but not without reckoning. If we cannot admit what we have allowed, then we do not deserve forgiveness." As her voice echoed into the dark, I looked at the faces lit by candlelight. People who had once doubted her now stood in reverence not to a building but to a woman who had dared to disturb the silence. The next morning, the demolition began. The bell tower was taken down piece by piece, not in anger but in closure. The bronze bell was sent to a foundry where it would be melted down and reshaped into 3 plaques, one for each victim known, one space left blank for the names we may never find, and on the 4th plaque in the center would be carved a single sentence. Here stood Trinity Church, where silence reigned until one widow spoke. I ran my fingers along the sketch of the memorial that the committee had shared with me. The design was simple, a circle of stone surrounding a tree planted in the center, a place for sitting, remembering a place where no sermon would be, spoken only truth. I would donate my mother's journals to the Survivor Archive Fund already being established in her name. The community would raise money for a trauma counseling center to be housed in the old rectory rooms that once held shame would now hold healing. It wasn't enough, but it was something, and when the new center opened, they asked me to cut the ribbon. I declined and handed the scissors to a woman named Teresa Banks, Rodney's niece, who had never known him but had grown up with his photo on her fridge and her grandmother's tears on her birthday cake. She smiled at me through tears and said, "Thank you for finding him." I shook my head. "No," I said. "My mother did. I just listened." And so the church fell, but not in disgrace, in testimony. Because sometimes the most sacred thing we can do is admit where we have failed and then build something better in the ruins. It began as an excavation, a controlled dismantling of the tower under the supervision of forensic teams and construction crews, but in truth it was a burial of myths, of unearned reverence, of a history built on polished wood hiding splinters beneath. And, beneath the tower, as the final stones were lifted and the old wooden foundation pulled apart, the earth revealed one last secret, one final cry for truth. A 4th body curled in the soil, skeletal arms folded over a rosary, decayed cloth still clinging to the bones. The workers stepped back in stunned silence, even those who had seen the other remains. Even the coroner, who had stopped flinching at the sight of death, paused and knelt slowly, whispering a quiet prayer, not from habit, but from instinct. Detective Harris arrived. Minutes later, I watched from the edge of the courtyard, heart frozen, lungs locked. The remains were small, too small. My breath caught when the forensics team murmured words that cracked through the quiet female mid-teens. Based on the pelvis, no ID on body, signs of blunt force trauma, matches, timeline of disappearance, early 2000s. Not Lillian, not Jane Doe. A 4th girl. A girl no one had looked for. A girl no one had listed as missing. A girl erased before her name ever reached a police file. They called her Trinity 4 in the report, but I could not bear it. She was not a number, not a footnote, not another shadow cast by men in robes. She had lived, breathed, smiled, cried somewhere. Someone had loved her. Someone had lost her without even knowing. That night, I searched every folder in my mother's closet again, every letter and note and corner of every page. And there, near the end of one notebook, was a scribbled name with no explanation. Angela written in a line by itself, circled twice, and beneath it the words, "She never spoke. She just came for the music." I found Mrs. Marlene the next morning standing outside the choir, building hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm tea, her eyes already knowing. "Angela," I said softly, "do you remember her?" She nodded without hesitation. Quiet girl, brown braids, big eyes, came to choir practice a few times around. "Oh, 3. Maybe never signed up officially. But she showed up with perfect pitch, never spoke a word, never came with parents. Did anyone notice when she stopped coming?" Marlene shook her head slowly, like the guilt weighed more than her bones. "Maybe we all noticed, but we told ourselves it didn't mean anything. That's what we were taught. Claire, not to ask, not to pry, not if it threatened the calm." I swallowed hard. That calm buried 4 bodies beneath us. I took the name to Harris, and within days a match came back. A Jane Doe report filed in 2003 matching dental records to a missing girl from Baton Rouge. No formal report was filed then because the girl had no guardian on record. She had been in the foster system in and out of placements. A number, not a name until now. Angela Fields, age 14, loved music, scored high on her placement tests, vanished after attending choir in New Orleans one Sunday afternoon. My mother had found her name, somehow kept it, remembered it even when no one else had. She had carried her in ink when the system dropped her in silence. Angela's photo was released publicly, and this time people noticed. One former caseworker from Baton Rouge came forward to confirm her identity. The community gathered again, not in shock this time, but in mourning of their own blindness. They had asked how many could there be, and the answer was one more than they thought. Bishop Pierce announced that Angela's plaque would be added to the memorial, her name etched in bronze beside Rodney and Lillian and Jane Doe, who remained unnamed but not forgotten. The 4th body had a name, and with it a voice. And yet, despite all the justice we had fought for, I found myself alone in my childhood home one evening, staring at my father's portrait that still hung by the staircase. His eyes were kind, or maybe that was memory deceiving me, I thought of. The day I learned to ride a bike in the alley behind the church, of how he had caught me when I fell, of how he had kissed my scraped knee and told me not all pain was punishment. Had he known Angela? Was she one of his students, his choir girls, one of the souls he was supposed to shepherd, or had he turned away again, afraid of what seeing her too clearly would demand from him? I would never know, but I did know what my mother had done. She had written down Angela's name. That was enough to keep the girl from being forgotten. I returned to Trinity as they laid the final stone in the circular garden that now stood in place of the tower. In the center, the new tree had begun to sprout a young magnolia, its roots stretching into the same ground where the tower had stood. I knelt and placed 4 white stones at its base, 1 for each soul lost, 1 for each truth. My mother had uncovered without a badge or a court order. The final ceremony was small, quiet, raw. Survivors spoke. Their voices shook, but they did not fall. One woman said, "I spent 20 years thinking I imagined what he did to me. But when I saw Claire on the news, I knew I wasn't crazy. I was ignored." Another said, "My son was in that church every Sunday. He's safe, but he won't be going back, not to a place that told us to whisper our pain." Then Bishop Pierce took the mic and announced the new name of the converted building. It would no longer be Trinity Church. It would be Eleanor House, a center for healing, for recovery, for memory, a place named not for saints but for a woman who dared to remember what others tried to erase. I could hardly breathe as the crowd erupted in applause, quiet at first, then rising like a tide of grace. "Mrs." Marlene slipped her hand in mine and whispered, "You gave her a name, Claire. She gave you the courage, but you gave Angela a name." I did not answer. I only squeezed her hand and watched the sun pass through the branches of the magnolia, as if it too were trying to reach the names carved below. Angela Fields. Lillian Cooper. Rodney Banks. One unknown still waiting to be remembered. And one widow who never stopped listening. The bell was gone, melted into truth. The cross had been lowered from the steeple and laid to rest in the soil beside the bodies it had once failed to protect. And in their place stood roots, not relics, not robes, not sermons, but roots, because now we did not build faith on forgetting. We built memory from the dirt. The first time I stepped back onto the grounds of what was once Trinity Church after everything had ended. The sky was washed in morning gold and the grass was damp with dew. The tower was gone, the sanctuary gutted, the pews removed and the altar dismantled. Only the shell of the old church remained hollow, but no longer haunted. In its place stood a garden, where stone paths curved around the memorial tree, and visitors walked slowly, reading names carved into bronze with reverence, not fear. I had been asked to speak at the dedication ceremony of Eleanor House, the new center for survivors built inside the old rectory. The organizers had even suggested I read something from my mother's journal, but I had declined. I didn't want to speak her words. I wanted to let them rest. She had spoken for too long with no one to hear. Now it was time to live in the echoes of her truth, not repeat them. Instead, I stood to the side, watching people gather, dozens, then hundreds. Some I recognized from town, others I didn't. Strangers who had followed the case from afar and come to see the place where silence was broken. The plaque by the garden gate bore a simple message. Here we remember. Rodney Banks, Lillian Cooper, Angela Fields, Jane Doe, and Eleanor Sullivan. Voices once silenced, now forever heard. Detective Harris stood beside me, his hands in his pockets, his tie loose from the heat. He looked over the garden, then toward the old stone steps and said, "You think she ever imagined this?" "I don't think she allowed herself to hope this far," I said. "But I think she planted the seed and hoped it would reach the sun." He nodded and smiled slightly. "You ever think about what comes next?" I looked across the crowd. Children ran across the grass, chasing each other between benches where once no child had dared to play. Survivors stood in small groups, holding hands, trading stories not for pity but for strength. Journalists took notes near a young girl sketching the memorial tree in a worn notebook, and somewhere a musician played violin under the magnolia, its song soft and unafraid. "What comes next?" I repeated. "I think this is what comes next. Healing. Not pretending. Forgiving without forgetting." We walked together through the new building, the rooms painted in warm light, the walls decorated with quotes, not from scripture, but from survivors. Every hallway had open doors. Every room had someone listening. Counselors, therapists, social, workers, volunteers, all committed not to dogma, but to dignity. In the old church office, now converted into a small library, I left my mother's journals on a polished wooden shelf beside other testimonies. I didn't write my name inside them. I didn't have to. The dedication page read, for those who were told their truth was too loud, and for the ones who never stopped whispering anyway. Outside, as the ceremony neared its end, Bishop Ronald Pierce stood at the garden altar and raised his voice over the crowd. "Today, we honor the lives lost, the voices found, and the courage it takes to speak. We do not bless this place because it is holy. We bless it because it is honest. Because here, truth is not feared, it is welcomed." He stepped back and handed the ribbon cutting to a teenage girl from the local foster program, who had once been removed from a dangerous home because of a hotline funded by donations to Eleanor House. Her name was Simone. She wore a white dress and trembling hands, and when she cut the ribbon, the crowd erupted in quiet applause more powerful than any sermon. I stayed behind when the crowd began to disperse, sitting on a stone bench beneath the magnolia. The sun filtered through its branches onto the ground, where 4 flat stones marked the names of Rodney, Lillian, Angela, and the unknown girl. Still being investigated, I placed fresh flowers on each one, not out of grief but gratitude. Then I stood, walked to the old foundation where the bell tower had once stood, and touched the stone circle at its heart. One final plaque embedded there read simply, "The bell tolled not for ceremony but for truth. Let it always ring again." And as if on cue, the small bell newly cast from the old one rang out once above the courtyard. Not in mourning, not in warning, but in remembrance, its sound clear and whole carried by wind across New Orleans. People stopped. Some turned. Some closed their eyes. Some wept. I stood in that sound, arms at my sides, heart open, not broken, and I breathed in everything that had been built from ruins. Not stained glass, not hymns, not confessions, but something far stronger. Memory, justice, voice, and I whispered, "Thank you, Mom." Because in the end, this was her story, her quiet rebellion, her relentless courage. And now it was mine to carry, not as a burden, but as a banner. The silence had ended, and the bells would never be silenced again. And so the last stone was laid, not to hide, but to honor, not to bury, but to remember what began. With a bell tolling in the night, ended in voices rising together, not in fear, but in truth. A church that once silenced cries of pain became a sound, place where no story was too small, no name too forgotten, no wound too deep to heal. Eleanor Sullivan once stood alone with nothing but her journal and her grief. Today her name stands carved in stone, surrounded by light, not judgment. And her daughter stands where silence once ruled, holding a future shaped by courage, not denial. The story of Trinity Church is not just about the crimes that were hidden, but the strength it took to uncover them. It's about a mother who refused to let fear define her, a daughter who turned pain into purpose, and a town that chose to remember instead of forget. In a world where truth is often inconvenient and justice slow, this story reminds us that silence is never neutral. It always protects someone and harms someone else. If this story moved, you please subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that reveal not just what happened, but why it matters. Comment below your thoughts, your emotions, or share a moment when you chose to speak truth even when it was hard. And most importantly, share this story so that Eleanor's voice and the voices of those like her are never silenced again. Because somewhere, someone is still whispering, and they need to know you are listening.